Hi everyone, happy Monday again, coming to you live from Los Angeles. I'm Kaleigh Cornelison and I'm a trainer and facilitator, formerly living in St. Louis, now at Angelino. And today we're going to be talking about warning signs of burnout and trauma exposure response. And so my talk last week was a little bit about how to infuse trauma-informed care into all youth serving spaces. And today I'm going to talk about, like I said, burnout, trauma exposure response, and a little bit about what those warning signs are, the definition of trauma exposure response, and some lesser known warning signs of burnout. So burnout, compassion fatigue, trauma exposure response, those are all different terms kind of in my mind to explain the same types of reactions. So it's less to me about what you call it and more about recognizing those warning signs when they come up. This can be kind of a sensitive and difficult topic for us to talk about because a lot of times when we recognize those warning signs of burnout in ourselves, that's a sign to us that something isn't right, something needs to change. We need to take a step back and examine maybe what we're doing or how we're doing it. And next week, next Monday, again at 8:30 Central Time, I'm going to talk about some of those strategies to confront burnout and trauma exposure. But today we're just going to talk about those warning signs. So a little bit about my journey into understanding my own burnout and compassion fatigue was I was working in, again, an organization, I mentioned this last week, where we didn't really talk a lot about the trauma that we were exposed to as staff. And so I was developing a training for our staff and some of our other partners in the region that did similar work with young people. And you know, I was like, yeah, my trauma, like, I'm pretty okay. I don't feel burnt out. I'm not having some of those classic signs of burnout in the way that I understood it at the time. And so I was reading this fabulous book that I'm going to share a lot of different pieces from today as well as next week, called Trauma Stewardship by a gal named Laura van Dernoot Lipsky. And the subtitle of the book is An Everyday Guide to Caring for Self While Caring for Others. And so I was reading this book and I thought, well, this is going to make some great training material. Let me develop a training based on what she shares in this book, including the 16 warning signs of trauma exposure response, which we'll go through today. And as I was reading the book, I kind of had one of those aha moments where I was recognizing ways that I was showing up in the world, the way that the work was affecting me, that weren't warning signs that I was already familiar with. So this book really introduced me to some new warning signs of compassion fatigue, warning signs of burnout that I'm going to share with you all today, and I hope that that will be helpful to you as well. So I do think that it's kind of scary for us to admit that we're impacted by our work, but it's really key for us to do that so we can continue to do our work with integrity, that we can take care of ourselves and confront that exposure that we have. So just a quick definition in the book, Laura explains trauma exposure response as the transformation that takes place within us as a result of exposure to the suffering of other living beings or the planet itself. So basically, in other words, the ways in which the world looks and feels different as a result of you doing your work. And a lot of us maybe can relate to that, you know, the way the world looks and feels different, in that, you know, once you're aware of something like racism, sexism, homophobia, misogyny, you know, the list can go on and on. You can't really unknow those things. You can't really unsee those things. You work with a client or a patient or, you know, whoever you're working with, and you hear their story, and that affects you and the way that you see the world. And so that's kind of a new phrase, if you're not familiar with it, a new term, trauma exposure response, just to be familiar with. And so I'm going to actually go through the 16 warning signs that are laid out in the Trauma Stewardship book, because I found them to be really, really helpful. And I'm going to show you some visuals that I hope will come through in the video well enough, so that you can kind of see them, but I'll kind of describe them and read them as well. In a training that I do on this topic, I'll put these same cards up on the walls around the room where the training is taking place, and I'll ask everyone to do what I would call a gallery walk activity, where they will walk around the room and read the different signs, and then go back and stand by the one that is most meaningful to them, is most impacting them personally. So that's a little bit how I would do this activity if I were doing it in an in-person training type setting. So as I'm going through these 16 warning signs, I would just encourage you to reflect on these, consider which ones are showing up in your life, which ones might be showing up in your colleagues that you've noticed, and think about which ones maybe are surprising to you, because I think some of them are more typical ones that we would think of, and some maybe aren't as well known, or maybe we're noticing it but we're not thinking of it as something that is a result of the work that we're doing, that is a result of our exposure to trauma. Okay, so let's just start. So each one has a quote, and I'm going to read the quote, and it also has a comic, because while this topic is difficult and hard to talk about sometimes, it's also important to bring humor into what we do, and that can also be really healing and helpful. So here's the first one, and again, I hope that this comes through okay on the video, and it says, the first warning sign is a sense that one can never do enough. And the quote on this one says, "It's not a feeling, it's true. If I don't do it, it's not going to get done. And if it doesn't get done, people die. I could never do enough." And this is from an attorney for inmates sentenced to capital punishment. And you see the little comic here, it's some penguins looking at another penguin who's flying, and they say, "Oh, we just haven't been flapping hard enough." So that one I think is a pretty common one, that I can't do enough. If no one else, if I don't do it, no one else will do it. I have to do it. I can never do enough. That's one that tends to resonate with people quite a bit. This next one is feeling hopeless and helpless. The quote says, "I have witnessed mortality of frogs in Panama, and we can now predict this disease's path and to some degree its date of arrival. We can't do anything to stop it or help frogs in the wild." And this is the University of Maryland Department of Biology professor. Feeling hopeless and helpless. And this one, the wolves are howling at the moon in the comic, and one wolf is saying, "My question is, are we really making an impact?" So again, I think a lot of us can probably relate to that feeling of hopelessness or helplessness. This next one is hypervigilance. Again, I think this is one that people are typically associating with trauma exposure. The quote here says, "I eat in a hurry, I do everything in a hurry, because I feel like there is a ticking time bomb waiting to go off." That's from a community activist. And this comic says, this little dog that's in therapy says, "I bark at everything, can't go wrong that way." Next one is one that might not be as immediately familiar for folks, which is diminished creativity. And this quote really resonates with me too. It says, "All my energy goes into just getting through my days. I don't meditate anymore or write. That's what I used to do at night. I don't do anything anymore but work and go home and watch TV." And that's from a community organizer. And that one really resonates, I think, because those of us who get home, crash, watch TV, veg out, don't really engage in other activities that maybe used to bring us joy because we're so exhausted from the work that we're doing, that one can be a big one. And this little comic on this one says, "Really, I'm fine. I was just a fleeting sense of purpose. I'm sure it will pass." Again, one that might not be as immediately obvious for folks is the inability to embrace creativity. So really that black and white thinking. This quote says, I learned to make my mind large as the universe is large, so that there is room for paradoxes. And that's from Maxine Hong Kingston, who was a writer and National Humanities Medal honoree. And the comic on this one says, what I'm proposing is this: no. So you see that inability to embrace complexity. Next one is minimizing. Wow, this one really resonates with me for sure. So the quote says, I minimize with myself. If anything happens, I'm like, well, I didn't get shot, so what do I have to complain about? And the comic is Superman relaxing by the pool, and he's saying, listen, pal, they're all emergencies. And that one really takes me back to one of the first jobs that I had back in St. Louis, which was working at an after-school program for elementary age kiddos. And we had a lot of shootings that actually happened in our neighborhood. And I remember telling friends that, family that, and then being just shocked and saying, oh, it's not that big a deal. It happens all the time. Minimizing. It's kind of the classic example of that. The next one, chronic exhaustion and physical ailments. And this one to me goes really directly along with the diminished creativity. This quote says, I don't have the energy for anything anymore. It literally takes all my energy to get up and try to just walk the dog, let alone do anything else. You don't even have energy anymore for the things you enjoy doing. Doing anything at all feels like too much. And that's from a domestic violence worker. And the comic on this one says, no, not there, please. That's where I'm going to put my head. This one is inability to listen and deliberate avoidance. So the quote on this one is simple. It's a nurse who says, I leave my voicemail box full. And the comic here says, no, Thursday's out. How about never? Is never good for you? And I think we see that sometimes, people calling out for sick day after day. It's that person who's not able to show up, not answering calls, not answering emails, and so that deliberate avoidance. Or it's someone that you're trying to have a conversation with and they can't give you their attention. So those are some of those warning signs. The next one is dissociative moments. All right, so this can include flashbacks. So the quote says, I can see the people trying to get across the bridge just like I can see you right in front of me. I close my eyes and I can see the people who died. This is a post-Hurricane Katrina reconstruction volunteer. And the comic on this one says it's the cows watching their friend jump over the moon, and they say, but she'll come down eventually, and she'll come down hard. This next one is a sense of persecution. So the quote here says, what if you can't do anything different? I'm in my 4th year of residency. What if leaving isn't an option? It's a family medicine resident. And the quote, or the comic of the 2 little dogs here, it says, it's always sit, stay, heal, never think, innovate, be yourself. So it's that sense of persecution that you can't choose to do something different, that you can't make a change. Another warning sign. This one's pretty straightforward, guilt. The quote on this one says, I went shopping last week for a pair of shoes and I thought to myself, what kind of person would go shopping for a pair of shoes right now? This is from a community activist in New Orleans 9 months after Katrina. And the comic on this one says, these 2 little gals at yoga, I just found an Eastern philosophy that's very accepting of SUVs. Next one is fear. That one's pretty straightforward. And here's a quote from a Persian poet that says, fear is the cheapest room in the house. I'd like to see you in better living conditions. And the comic here says, these little kiddos, I like recess a lot better before the safety helmets. So that increased sense of fear. Next is anger and cynicism. The quote here says, I have all this anger bottled up inside me and I feel like I can't let it out. I wouldn't know what to do with it and I feel like it'd be too much. So it's just inside me and I can't hold it in anymore. It's a child protective services worker. The comic on this one is two little elves in Santa's workshop, and one is saying, obviously behind all the jolliness, there's a lot of rage. That one's maybe my favorite comic of all the ones that I'm sharing. So that's funny. The next one is inability to empathize and numbing. This one might really resonate for some folks. It says, my children say I don't play with them anymore. I don't sing anymore. I don't laugh anymore. This is a family law attorney. And the comic here says, are you sure you're not confusing manic depressive with awake asleep? And honestly, this numbing one was the one that when I read the book myself that really kind of opened my eyes, because I was like, I'm totally fine. I'm not upset. I'm not hypervigilant. I'm not tearful. I'm not ruminating on things. But really it was the fact that I was like totally numb to everything that was going on around me. I built up so many protective walls that I couldn't really feel much of anything. So that was one that really resonated for me when I first learned about it. This one, addictions. So the quote on this one says, I look at my watch to see what time it is and how long until I can have a glass of wine. I mean, somewhere in the world, it's got to be cocktail hour. And this is a human rights advocate. And the comic on this one, these two guys in the bar, and one guy saying, boy, I'm going to pay for this in yoga class tomorrow. And I think it's interesting to kind of expand that definition of addictions, because I think typically we jump to drugs and alcohol, but it can also be that constant scrolling on our phones, the social media stuff. You know, it could be food, it can be a lot of different behaviors that are a lot of times used for numbing. So as you can see, a lot of these warning signs are really, really interconnected. So here's the last one, which is grandiosity, an inflated sense of importance in one's work. The quote on this says, throughout the hospital, the only social workers who connected so strongly with their work as if it was their total identity were the ER social workers. They were the only group that if you asked them, everyone would say, I'm an ER social worker. It was their whole identity. This is the hospital administrator. And the comic on this one, the woman saying to the man, must you precede everything you say with, this is your captain speaking? And that one's one that's really interesting to end on because that might not be one that we're thinking of, right? I think a lot of us are probably really proud of the work that we do, but I think it comes in as a warning sign when our whole identity is the work that we do. And that's, again, just, these are all things not to feel bad about. These are things to be aware of and to consider ways to address them and to care for yourself as you care for others in the work that you do. So I'm gonna put a image of there's an entire graph that kind of shows these all in a circle that has them all laid out in the comments for today's talk. And that way you can have a little bit more time to look at them and process them. And if folks are interested in the comics or the quotes that were associated with these, feel free to message me and let me know. I'd be happy to share those. And really just take some time to reflect on that, which ones resonated for you. And I always say when I do this training in person, everybody connects to at least one and usually more than one. And usually those are connected in some sort of way. So again, this isn't to make you feel like you're doing something wrong, that there's something wrong with you, because there's not. These are really common and typical responses to being exposed to trauma and being exposed to the pain and hardship and suffering of those that we serve. So between now and next week, kind of take some time, reflect on these. If you feel comfortable and you want to leave in the comments of this talk which one resonated the most with you, that might be helpful for us, again, to kind of continue to build our community and support each other and just kind of say, oh yeah, me too. Like I shared, numbing was really the one that I tend to go to. That's my main coping strategy for when I'm feeling stressed and overwhelmed and affected by my work. So I hope that you'll tune in or watch the talk from next Monday, again at 8:30 Central Time, because that's when we're actually going to get into the strategies that will hopefully be helpful for addressing a lot of these warning signs of trauma exposure response and compassion fatigue and burnout. So thanks for watching. Talk to you guys next week.